This video may contain what could be considered attorney advertising under the rules of your state. This video is for information purposes only and should not be construed as legal advice. If you have a legal problem, it's vital for you to seek out and talk to a licensed attorney for advice. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you may be. My name is Chris Simmons, attorney at law, and today we're going to start a video series on freedom of speech. Now, freedom of speech is my favorite type of law. I cannot wait until we're able to discuss hate speech, until we're able to discuss speech in a private setting, when we can talk about defamation, when we can talk about campaign finance laws, but we need to speak the same language. So this video, we're going to step back away from all controversy and we're just going to talk about the fundamentals. In this video, we're going to go over the very basics of freedom of speech. In the next video, we'll go over unprotected speech, and then we'll go from there. So first, we need to understand where our freedom of speech comes from and who it applies to. So the First Amendment of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, states that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Now it adds some extra rights in there, but that's the one we're focusing in on. Note that it's Congress. This does not apply to private citizens, private corporations. If you're a private citizen, the First Amendment does not apply to you. You can tell your neighbor to shut up. You can say the extremely hateful thing. You may have consequences, but the First Amendment does not stop you from doing that. Rather, the government can't make a law restricting freedom of speech. But even that blanket statement is too broad. The government can, in fact, make laws that restrict speech. In fact, it does it all the time. But the way it does it, how much of a restriction it is allowed to do, and even what types of speech the government can engage in, are all in the jurisprudence of First Amendment law. So, let's start with the very basic thing. We need to understand two very basic concepts, very core concepts, and that is content neutral versus viewpoint neutral, or content based versus viewpoint based. Now, the easiest way for me to think of these, and while this is not the proper terminology, it is a good analogy, I feel, is genre and subgenre. Content based restrictions are restrictions based on the content of the speech, the genre of the speech, so to speak. So, for instance, I may engage in political speech. Well, that's the genre of political speech. There's a genre of music. There's a genre of art. There's a genre of, well, whatever you can think of. That's what content is. Viewpoint is the subgenre. That's the way I think of it. So, if I say something that is pro-capitalism, well, that's a subgenre of political speech. If I say something that's pro-communism, that's a subgenre of political speech. So, I think the easiest way to explain this is the government, if it needs to do a content neutral, it can't discriminate against any genre of speech. All content must be allowed. If it has to be viewpoint neutral, well then they can restrict the genre, but they can't restrict the subgenre. Now, say for instance, we are in a specific place called a forum that allows the government to restrict based on content. Well, they can say you can only have political speech. That's content-based restrictions. But they can't then go and say that only Republicans can speak. That would be viewpoint discrimination, and that is never upheld. I can't think of a time it would be, because it is the antithesis of our First Amendment. So that is content and viewpoint. Now, those places where we're allowed to speak, that's called a forum. And this is the other part that we need to understand. Now, If you talk to most attorneys, they will tell you there are 3 forums. They are correct. I, however, break it down into 4. And that is just for more accurate descriptions. I break it down into public, designated public, limited public, and non-public. Now, the other attorneys, they will combine designated public and a public forum because they operate the exact same way. So let's go over how these two operate. A public forum is one that has been public and open to all types of speech for time immemorial. And that's the keywords that the Supreme Court has used. These are your places that I can't think of a time when there hasn't been free speech allowed. These are your public sidewalks, your public parks. These are places where people's always protested. People's always done whatever they wanted on those places. A designated public forum is a traditionally non-public forum that the government has designated and said this is open to all types of speech. They function the same way, but one is designated and one is not. So, what type of restrictions can the government place on public forums? Well, you would think they can't place any, but that would be wrong. They can place what is called time, manner, and place restrictions. These are content neutral. It must be content neutral. But for various reasons, whether it's public safety or just not to create a nuisance, they can restrict the time, place, and manner. They can't tell you that you can't speak because you're going to say something that's political or you can't play music, but they can place a restriction on the time, place, and manner. These are non-discretionary decisions. There can be no discretion made by the person making the decision. You either get the permit or you don't. That's just how it works. That's why when the governor of a state says, we don't think that these people should be allowed to march, that's a problem with First Amendment. Whether you agree with that decision or not, that is a problem with First Amendment. Because you have the governor stating that you cannot march here. Now, what's some other types of reasonable restrictions? Well, let's say there's a public interest in protecting abortion clinics. So you can't, say a governor passes a law that says that no protest can happen within 30 yards of an abortion clinic for the safety of the women going in to get these abortions. Well, if that is a legitimate government interest in protecting these women, and it leaves a reasonable alternative for that speech, a reasonable place in which that speech can occur, well, they might be able to do that. So the reasonable place would be that the protesters can do it right outside that 30 yards. If the amount of space is too big, that's unreasonable. If it's too small, well, you're not really doing your job. So there's a little bit of give and take here. And this is where all arguments come from. But just remember, for public forum, content neutral, time, place, and manner restrictions, and there has to be a reasonable alternative. Next, we get to limited public forums. These are non-public forums that the government only allows certain types of speech, certain genres of speech to be conducted in. The best example of this I can think of is a publicly funded theater. The government can say, we don't want political speech here. We only want concerts. We only want music played. That is a content restriction that the government can make because it's a limited public forum. But the government cannot discriminate based on viewpoint. They can't say, we'll only allow electro swing in this establishment. We'll only allow rap in this establishment. We'll only allow country in this establishment. It's either all music or no music. You don't get to discriminate against subgenres. ever when it's a limited public forum. But you can limit it to certain genres of speech, to certain content. And finally, we get to non-public forums. Now, these are places where the government can restrict all speech. Think military bases. Think prisons. These are the general areas that first come to mind when we think non-public forums. The government can restrict all speech in these. No one's allowed free speech, but the moment the government allows some type of speech, so if it's a prison, they start to say, yeah, we'll allow our prisoners to have concerts. So they can bring in Elvis, but the moment they do that, they also have to give the opportunity to other people. So again, it can be, once it becomes open to a specific type of speech, well, it becomes kind of like a limited public forum, in that type of speech can be allowed, but they can't discriminate against viewpoint. The question really becomes, once they've allowed a certain type of speech in, can they shut it out? Can they shut it out completely? So, and that gets to certain arguments that you'll hear on both sides of the jurisprudence. There's case law to go in this, but think of a non-public forum as a place where you don't let anyone talk, but if you do let someone talk, you can't discriminate based on their viewpoint. So, public forum, designated public forum, limited public forum, non-public forum, content-based, viewpoint-based. We also need to understand that the First Amendment only applies to government and not to private. And finally, I want to give this small bit of information. When the government speaks, it can say whatever it wants. What do I mean by that? Well, if the government pays for the DARE program that I grew up with in middle school, elementary school, middle school, high school, well, the government doesn't have to give equal time to the other side. The government doesn't have to say anything in a neutral way. The government is speaking, so the government can say whatever it wants. But the government can't then restrict the other side of the speech just because they don't agree with it. So when the government speaks, it can say whatever it wants. Your recourse is to speak louder. Or if you don't like what they're saying, to essentially vote the people out, affect political change, speak up louder, protest, etc. You have ways of speaking against the government. And that's what our First Amendment is. It's a way to protect us from the government shutting down our speech. Now, next, we're going to go over some unprotected types of speech, because not all speech is protected. So, we'll get to that video next. I'll see you in the next one.